The morning was calm. The sky was clear, and the sun shone brightly over the earth. People went about their daily lives, unaware that something was about to change everything. High above the world, in the vastness of space, something was stirring. A fleet of strange ships, massive, dark, and silent, entered Earth's atmosphere, crossing the border of human territory without warning. No one saw them coming, and by the time anyone noticed, it was already too late. At first, it was only a blip on the radar, small enough to ignore. Military officials and scientists dismissed it, thinking it was just another satellite or a random space debris. But the blip grew larger. And faster. As the mysterious ships descended into Earth's atmosphere, panic slowly spread across the world. The airspace had been breached. The world's governments scrambled to respond, trying to make sense of the situation. News reports flooded in from every corner of the globe. People stared at the sky, shocked and confused. What were these ships? Where did they come from? Who was inside? A signal came through just as tensions began to rise. The message was short, strange, and filled with a terrifying sense of authority: "We've crossed the border. And you will never be the same." It was clear, this was no ordinary encounter. These weren't just visitors from another country, another planet, or even another galaxy. Whoever, or whatever, they were, their message sent a chill down the spines of the world's leaders. For hours, the world was in a state of complete uncertainty. Military forces were put on high alert. Satellites and drones were sent to monitor the situation, but nothing could prepare them for what happened next. As people tried to make sense of the cryptic message, the first attacks came. Cities across the world were struck by powerful energy beams that tore through buildings, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. The attacks were fast and precise, as if the invaders knew exactly where to strike. Governments and military forces attempted to fight back, launching missiles and fighter jets into the sky. But they were powerless. The invaders' ships moved with a terrifying grace, dodging every attack with ease. Earth's weapons were useless against them. The world was in chaos. In the midst of this madness, a man named General Daniel Hart was woken from his sleep. The emergency alarms rang through his home, echoing the panic that had spread across the globe. He quickly dressed and made his way to the command center, his mind racing with questions. What was happening? Who were these invaders? And why had they come? As he arrived at the command center, the air was thick with tension. The military had mobilized, but the situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. The radar showed dozens of ships, and more appeared every minute. They were positioned above major cities, waiting. The leaders of the world were in a state of shock. They had never faced anything like this before. General Hart took a deep breath and spoke with determination. "We need to prepare for everything. We don't know who they are or what they want, but we can't just sit here. We'll defend our planet with everything we have." But no one was sure how to fight back. The invaders were far beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. The fear in the air was palpable. People everywhere knew that the world had just crossed a line, one that would change everything. No one knew what the invaders wanted, but one thing was clear: the borders of human civilization had been crossed, and there was no turning back. As General Hart prepared for a response, he glanced up at the screen showing the mysterious ships overhead. A thought crossed his mind: who were they? And more importantly, why did they choose now to reveal themselves? As the world waited in fear and confusion, humanity's greatest test had begun. The invaders were here. And nothing would ever be the same again. The world's nerves were on edge. Hours passed, and still, the ships hovered in Earth's skies, casting massive shadows over cities below. The military attempted to gain control of the airspace, but nothing they did had any effect on the invaders. The ships, black and sleek, remained unmoved, seemingly unaffected by any weapon or missile fired their way. The mystery deepened. These were no ordinary visitors. Their technology was light years ahead of anything humanity had. In the midst of the tension, General Daniel Hart was summoned for a meeting with the world's top leaders. The situation was growing worse by the minute. Military intelligence had intercepted several transmissions from the invaders, but they were in a language no human could understand. The cryptic message they had received earlier still echoed in everyone's minds: "We've crossed the border. And you will never be the same." What did it mean? What was the intent behind the attack? Was this an invasion? Or a warning? The room fell silent as General Hart spoke. "We can't wait any longer. They've already shown their power. We need to make a move before they decide to make theirs." But as he spoke, something unexpected happened. The sky, once filled with nothing but calm, suddenly erupted with energy. A low hum, like a thunderous growl, grew louder and louder until it vibrated the very air around them. People looked up in horror. Without warning, the invaders fired. Energy beams shot down from the ships above, powerful enough to obliterate entire city blocks in seconds. It wasn't just an attack, it was a warning, a demonstration of overwhelming power. The beams were focused, precise, and relentless, cutting through buildings and military defenses as if they were paper. The streets turned to chaos as the first wave of destruction began. Cities like New York, Tokyo, London, and Moscow were hit hardest. Buildings crumbled, and fires erupted, leaving behind nothing but debris and ash. People fled in panic, some running into underground shelters, while others were trapped in the wreckage. The streets became rivers of smoke, and the air was thick with dust and fear. As the first wave of destruction subsided, the silence that followed felt suffocating. What was left? The invaders hadn't just destroyed the cities, they had crippled humanity's ability to respond. There were no clear answers, only chaos and devastation. The world's leaders scrambled to communicate with each other, but communications were jammed. The invaders had disabled Earth's ability to connect, leaving humanity isolated in its worst hour. General Hart stood at the command center, his eyes glued to the screen. A map of the world showed the coordinates of the alien ships, their numbers growing by the hour. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. What could they do now? The world's military, despite its strength, was powerless against the invaders. "Sir," a voice interrupted his thoughts. One of the technicians looked up, panic in their eyes. "We've intercepted another transmission. It's coming from the invaders." Hart nodded and motioned for it to be played. The message was short, but it struck deep into the heart of humanity's fear. "This is only the beginning. Prepare yourselves. The border is closed. You cannot win." The invaders were taunting them. They knew they were in control, and it seemed like there was no way to stop them. The message ended with a deep, unsettling hum, as if the invaders were daring Earth to challenge them. In the following hours, as Earth's people gathered in shelters and underground bunkers, whispers of the invaders' true power spread. Some believed that the aliens had come to conquer. Others thought they were here to test humanity's will. But the truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. These weren't just invaders, they were something much more dangerous. The Earth had crossed a threshold. The invaders had come, and they had already proven that nothing in humanity's arsenal could stop them. They were something more advanced, more intelligent, and more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. But even as humanity trembled, something else was stirring. Among the wreckage, small groups of survivors began to take notice. A group of soldiers, a team of scientists, and ordinary civilians, bound by the will to survive, started to piece together what had happened. The invaders hadn't just come to destroy, they had come to take something from Earth. But what could it be? The world was on the edge of despair, and the question on everyone's mind was the same: how do you fight something that is already light years ahead? In the midst of all the destruction, one thing was clear: the fight was just beginning. And Earth's true test was yet to come. The world was in pieces. The first attack had crippled humanity's defenses, leaving entire cities in ruins. The air was thick with dust, and the sounds of sirens and cries of panic echoed in the streets. But in the midst of the chaos, a strange sense of realization began to creep over General Daniel Hart. He couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening, something beyond just a simple invasion. The invaders weren't acting like conquerors, they were behaving like visitors, but visitors with a dark, unsettling purpose. As the days passed, humanity scrambled to rebuild its shattered forces. People huddled in shelters, and leaders made desperate plans to counterattack, but nothing seemed to work. The invaders, though seemingly relentless, didn't press forward with a full invasion. They remained in their ships, hovering over key locations around the globe. Their ships were silent but always present, watching, waiting. Then, just as the world began to lose hope, a breakthrough came, albeit in the most unexpected form. A team of scientists, working in secret deep underground, managed to crack the invaders' communication code. The message they received was cryptic but carried a weight that no one was prepared for. The text on the screen was simple, but its meaning shook the foundations of everything humanity knew. "We are of your blood." At first, no one understood what it meant. The message didn't provide further details, but it was clear enough to raise suspicions. Was it some kind of psychological tactic? Was this an elaborate trick to manipulate humanity into surrendering? But General Hart felt something strange. Deep in his gut, he knew the truth was far more complex than mere manipulation. The truth was revealed slowly, piece by piece, and the more they learned, the more horrifying the reality became. The invaders, as it turned out, were not some distant alien species or creatures from another world. They were humans, but not the same kind of humans that Earth had grown to know. The team of scientists unearthed a secret history that had been buried for millennia. Thousands of years ago, long before recorded history, a group of humans had left Earth. They had traveled far into the depths of space, seeking to escape the growing conflicts and limitations of the planet. Over time, they had evolved, not just physically but biologically. Their technology became so advanced that they eventually returned to Earth, now viewing humanity's progress with both concern and disdain. They called themselves the Exiles, the descendants of the original humans who had left Earth. They had seen their mission as one of survival, not just exploration. Over the centuries, their society had grown into something unimaginable, mastering technologies that allowed them to control vast swaths of space. The Exiles had come back, not to conquer, but to ensure that humanity didn't repeat the mistakes they had made in their distant past. The most shocking revelation was that these exiles viewed Earth's current state of technological progress with fear. To them, humanity had become too powerful, too reckless. The exiles feared that the next step in human evolution could lead to disaster, not just for Earth, but for the entire galaxy. They had come, not to destroy, but to guide humanity, to take control before humanity could hurt itself and others. But the question remained, why hadn't they communicated this directly? Why the attacks, the destruction? The answer was simple and terrifying. The exiles didn't trust humanity. They believed that Earth's people had become too unpredictable, too violent, and too egotistical. They needed to test humanity, to see if they could truly be reasoned with or if they would fight to the bitter end, as they always had. General Hart stood before the gathering of world leaders, his mind racing with the implications of what had been uncovered. The invaders were humans, his own bloodline. But how could they come to Earth with such authority, such arrogance, demanding that humanity accept their rule? There was no easy answer, no way to know for sure what the future held. As the days passed, the world waited for the exiles to reveal more. The power of their ships, the silence in the skies, and the cryptic messages all pointed to something far more complex than a mere attack. The exiles were not just invaders, they were humanity's ancestors, returning to reclaim what they had once abandoned. The fear that gripped Earth was now mingled with a sense of curiosity. Was this humanity's fate? Were the exiles truly the saviors they claimed to be, or were they simply a more advanced species intent on controlling everything they left behind? General Hart didn't know the answer, but the fate of Earth, and the survival of humanity, depended on it. The next move was critical. Humanity was no longer just fighting for survival, they were fighting for their place in the universe. And the truth was, they weren't sure if they would win or lose. The question that remained was the same: could humanity find a way to coexist with their ancient relatives, or would they be doomed to fight their own kind to the bitter end? The revelation of the exiles' true identity had shaken the world to its core. General Daniel Hart stood on the balcony of the command center, gazing out at the ruined cityscape. What had once been a thriving metropolis was now little more than rubble. The air was thick with dust, the remnants of buildings that had once touched the sky. The exiles, their ships hovering ominously above, had delivered their message: humanity was at a crossroads. But as Hart stood there, surrounded by the wreckage, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. The exiles weren't just here to control, they were testing humanity. For weeks, the exiles had continued their quiet presence in the skies, making no further moves of aggression. They were patient, observing, waiting. But time was running out. The Earth had already suffered unimaginable losses. The people were tired of waiting. The world, once divided by borders and nations, now found a common enemy. For the first time in history, humanity united in a singular cause: survival. But it wasn't just survival that the people craved anymore. The more they learned about the exiles, the more they realized that if they didn't act soon, they would lose control of their own future. It wasn't long before scattered pockets of resistance began to form. It started small, a group of soldiers here, a handful of scientists there. But soon, the resistance grew. These weren't just groups of people who wanted revenge, they were people who wanted to fight for their future, to reclaim the destiny that had been stolen from them. People from every corner of the earth began to rise, each one motivated by a different reason but unified by the same goal: to challenge the exiles and take back control. General Hart found himself in the heart of this growing rebellion. As the leader of the Earth's military forces, he had been thrust into a position of responsibility, but this wasn't just about military tactics anymore. It was about something bigger, a chance to prove humanity's worth. The exiles had already dismissed them, believing that they were too unpredictable and too violent to evolve peacefully. But General Hart refused to let humanity be defined by that one part of their history. He believed there was more to humanity than the mistakes of the past. The resistance began to strategize. They needed to learn more about the exiles' technology, specifically, the way their ships operated and what their weaknesses might be. Scientists from around the world came together, pooling their knowledge in hopes of finding something, anything, that could give them an edge. One group of engineers managed to reverse engineer a piece of the exiles' technology, revealing a single vulnerable point on the ships. It was a breakthrough, a spark of hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. But as humanity's resistance grew, so did the pressure from the exiles. The ships above Earth began to move, not with the same eerie stillness, but with an air of intent. The exiles were no longer just watching, they were preparing. General Hart understood that their time was running out. If they didn't act now, if they didn't take the fight to the exiles before they made their next move, it might be too late. The world's resistance forces, now organized and better equipped, launched their first counteroffensive. It wasn't an all-out war, it was a message. Humanity wasn't going to roll over and die. They wouldn't allow themselves to be controlled. With what little they had, they struck at the invaders, targeting weak points in their ships and infrastructure. The first attack was a success. They managed to cripple one of the exiles' smaller crafts, sending a message to the exiles that humanity would no longer cower. The victory was bittersweet, though. The exiles retaliated with a devastating blow. A barrage of energy beams rained down, causing widespread devastation once more. Entire cities were wiped off the map in an instant. But something was different this time: the people weren't running. They weren't hiding. The resistance had sparked something within humanity, a will to survive, a determination to fight back, no matter the cost. General Hart stood before the gathered resistance leaders, his face grim but resolute. The fight ahead would be brutal. The exiles were far more advanced, their technology far superior. But if there was one thing humanity had that the exiles didn't, it was resilience. They had faced the worst of themselves, and yet they had never given up. Now, that same spirit would be the key to their survival. The resistance began to gather forces from across the globe. Cities once broken were now filled with fighters, scientists, engineers, and civilians, every person who believed that the future of Earth should remain in human hands. The exiles may have had advanced technology, but humanity had something they could never understand, the ability to fight for freedom, to fight for their place in the universe. As the final preparations for the next attack were underway, General Hart felt a sense of resolve wash over him. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with unimaginable challenges. But humanity had made a choice. They would not be ruled. They would not be controlled. They would fight for their future, and for the future of every living soul on Earth. This wasn't just a war for survival anymore. It was a war for the right to exist on their own terms. The final battle was coming. And humanity was ready. The days leading up to the final battle were tense. The resistance, having learned more about the exiles' technology and weaknesses, knew the stakes had never been higher. Cities were rebuilt, makeshift armies formed, and even civilians who had once been ordinary workers now trained in combat. What had started as a desperate attempt to survive had become something much larger, a revolution. Humanity had found its strength in unity, a force the exiles had underestimated. Now, it was time to prove to the invaders that they had made a grave mistake. General Daniel Hart stood before a vast crowd of soldiers, engineers, scientists, and civilians, his eyes scanning the faces of those who had gathered. The war had cost them everything. Friends, family, entire communities had been lost, but still, they stood together. They had come to realize something powerful: survival was no longer enough. They had to win. Not just for themselves, but for every person who still believed in freedom, in choice, in life. In the command center, the air was thick with urgency. The resistance had launched a full-scale assault on the exiles' stronghold in Earth's orbit, targeting their largest ship. It was humanity's best shot. The exiles had always hovered above, never fully engaging in combat, only observing. But now, the time for waiting was over. General Hart's forces had gathered, and the exiles would no longer control the skies. "Prepare for launch," Hart ordered, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He had seen the destruction, felt the heartbreak of losing so many, but now was not the time for hesitation. The fate of the world rested on this moment. The final battle began. Fighters rose into the sky, their engines roaring with power, as massive ships filled with soldiers followed behind them. The resistance had developed new technology, adaptations of the exiles' own technology, reversed and re-engineered to fit their needs. These new weapons, though far from perfect, gave humanity the edge they needed to stand a chance. They were no longer the underdogs. They were fighting with everything they had. As the resistance forces approached the exiles' massive fleet, the silence in the air was overwhelming. The ships above Earth, once so still and cold, now came to life. Energy weapons on their hulls charged, and soon, the first waves of fire erupted from both sides. The skies turned into a battleground as humanity's ships clashed with the exiles' superior technology. Despite the fierce barrage of laser beams and missiles from the exiles, the resistance held their ground. They fought with every ounce of strength they had, their weapons hitting their targets with precision. The exiles' ships, while advanced, began to show signs of weakness. A ripple of hope spread through the ranks as one of their massive cruisers took a direct hit, its shields flickering and weakening. Humanity's technology had evolved, and they now had the power to strike back. But just as the resistance began to gain ground, the exiles launched their final weapon, an energy wave so powerful it could wipe out entire cities in a single blast. It was a move of desperation, a weapon that could end everything in one devastating strike. The world watched in horror as the energy wave began to build, a concentrated burst of power aimed directly at the heart of the resistance forces. General Hart, sitting in the command center, watched the approaching wave on his screen. His pulse quickened. The resistance had no time to react. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the rebel ships, piloted by a young woman named Lena, made a daring decision. She flew straight toward the wave, her ship's engines screaming as she pushed the vessel to its limits. She had only one chance to make it work. With a final, breathless scream, Lena activated the last of the Resistance's experimental technology, a powerful energy disruptor that had been designed to counteract the Exiles' weapons. The energy wave and the disruptor collided, causing a massive explosion in the skies above. The shockwave reverberated across the world, shaking the ground beneath their feet. For a moment, everything went silent. The air was still. The skies above, once filled with the fearsome power of the Exiles, now seemed to hold their breath. Then, slowly, the smoke cleared. The Exiles' flagship, the source of their weapons' power, had been disabled. The Resistance had done it. They had won. But the victory came at a great cost. Lena's ship, the one that had made the sacrifice, was destroyed in the explosion. The pilot had given her life for the cause, just as so many others had before her. The battle was over, but the war had taken its toll. As the remaining Exiles withdrew from Earth's orbit, the world erupted in both grief and celebration. The people of Earth had won, but they had lost so much in the process. Humanity had stood up against its own bloodline, and in the end, it was their determination, their unity, and their unyielding will to survive that had prevailed. General Hart stood alone on the balcony once more, his eyes watching the slowly calming skies. The Earth had been saved, but the world would never be the same again. The Exiles were gone, but their legacy, of power, of fear, and of the bond between the two branches of humanity, would remain. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: humanity had earned its place in the universe, and they would never again be defined by the past. Now, they would define their future.